Hello, this is Sam Lichtenstein filling in for Paul Carr, and this is episode 71 of the Unseen Podcast, the sister podcast to the Wow Signal podcast. You can find out more about the Unseen Podcast at unseenpodcast.com. I'm broadcasting here from New York City, Lower Manhattan, and today we're excited to have as a special guest on the panel, Lee Irons from Deep Space Ecology. And before I let him introduce himself and say a little about the company, I'm also joined tonight by Paul Carr. Hi, Paul.
Hello, Sam, and thanks for setting all this up. I didn't have to do any work at all.
I do my best. And Nick Nielsen over in Portland.
Hi, Sam, and hello to the Unseen Podcast, and hello to our special guest, Lee.
So Lee, why don't you introduce yourself and say a little bit about Deep Space Ecology?
Yeah, thanks for the introduction, guys, and glad to be joining you folks and everybody on Unseen Podcast. So a little bit about myself. I guess I would say I started in the space industry back in the 80s in graduate school. I was doing research for under a NASA Ames research grant at the University of Kansas on Space Station Freedom. Physics graduate student studying the effects of the space plasma in Earth orbit on the surfaces of satellites. Came out of graduate school. Of course, shuttle program is beginning to, and this is 1990, shuttle program is beginning to diminish somewhat, although our eggs are pretty much all still in that basket. If you want to get into the space industry, jobs are relatively few, and so I ended up going sideways into working for a DoD contractor under the Army Space Institute, and was instrumental in helping to deploy the first GPS units into the field with Desert Storm. From there, ended up going into the nuclear power industry, specifically on Navy nuclear power side, and worked out in Idaho, operating Navy prototype reactors and training Navy personnel. And then on into environmental remediation out at the Hanford site in Washington State, one of the old nuclear warhead plutonium generation facilities. Working on cleanup there, helping to clean up radioactive waste, transuranic waste, low-level and transuranic, mixed waste where you're getting into hazardous and radioactive together. And then from there over here to the East Coast with a short stint in the commercial industry for a couple of years in the Chicago area where I grew up, and joined the design team for the Ford class, new Ford class aircraft carrier, helping to design the propulsion plant. Ended up raising our kids here, and of course, my daughter, who's Chief Science Officer of Deep Space Ecology, got into Duke University, where she has done her research on closed ecological systems, and from there we started up this company. There's a little bit of an interesting story there. If we have time for me to share it, we were at the Humans to Mars Summit last spring in Washington, D.C. And we sat there listening to the talks and, going to the little dinner parties. And I began to get a sense that even though everybody was getting really excited, now that shuttle program is retired, and everybody's really beginning to talk about Mars and Elon Musk and with SpaceX and of course Blue Origins, all of this new excitement coming into the industry, we heard everybody still pretty much talking about rockets and still pretty much telling the young people that the thing to do would be to either get an aerospace engineering degree and join one of the rocket companies or apply to the astronaut program. And I'm looking around at all this great young talent, excited to get into the space industry like I was back in 1990 when I came out of graduate school, and still nobody really offering them a whole lot. And so I talked to my daughter. I said, one of these days, somebody's going to see all this young talent around here, and they're just going to snatch them all up, and they're going to do something with it. And in fact, at the end of that conference, they had an open mic, and I got up and I said something to that fact, that I was a little bit disappointed that everybody was still talking about rockets. Nobody was seemed to be talking about actual settlement, actually moving people out into space and getting them onto other bodies and actually beginning to inhabit those places and the things that would be required to make that happen, besides just getting off of Earth and traveling through space. And then after I spoke, just one young person after the next got up, going up to the mic and saying, I have $200,000 in student loans and I would love to go work in the space industry. But right now I'm trying to decide whether I even waste my time with that or whether I take this offer out in Silicon Valley to work on the next, internet startup.
So this is an audience of space geeks, right?
Yeah,
So
it's an audience of space geeks and space industry professionals, bigwigs and such. I mean, they had some NASA administrators there, and Bill Nye was there, and
but the space industry jobs themselves are scarce enough that these people they're not going to work for SpaceX for the most part. They're going to go work for Facebook or Google.
Right, exactly. Just because even with Elon Musk, even with these new space companies, everybody is still pretty much thinking, rocket type technology. They're thinking International Space Station kind of technology. How do humans live in space, right? And really not looking at the entire picture of everything that needed to be done, and just wasting all of this human capital, this new generation of young people excited about the things that are going on in private industry, and still not enough opportunity to, and just seeing all that human capital go to waste. It was just kind of sad.
So just for context, had Morgan, her research into closed ecosystem, had she already had in mind Mars colonization as a potential application for the technology in an academic context?
Yeah. In fact, it was, and she can probably share some of this with you in the show that you do with her. But she had started in second semester of her sophomore year doing research on this. In fact, 9 months before The Martian came out in the movies, she had this idea to start doing this research. And it's funny because when this movie came out, everybody that knows her, they pointed at the screen when he turns his folder around and it says The Botanist on it. Everybody points at the screen, goes, "That's Morgan." It was kind of funny. But yeah, she had this idea, and it kind of came through a crisis, a college career crisis that probably most students have around their sophomore year in college, trying to figure out really what they want to study. And she ended up shifting from biophysics and orthopedic surgeon to astroecologist.
Right. And one student major at Duke, I would imagine.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah. So yeah, Duke University is like the center of astronautical research in the universe, right? Not even close. But she's always had a lot of energy. And she found a professor willing to support an independent study for her that second semester in her sophomore year, completely replanned her curriculum. And then here we were a year later at the Humans to Mars conference. She had just started up her experiment at the Duke Research greenhouses, growing things in Martian regolith simulant. Actually, no, I take that back. She hadn't started yet. While we were at the conference, we got the phone call from the FedEx guy trying to figure out where he was supposed to deliver 2,000 pounds of basaltic sand. And so she had to step out of the conference and coordinate with folks that she knew down there to get the stuff dropped off at the right place. So that was kind of funny. She actually didn't start growing things until about a month later. But yeah, here we were at the conference a year later. She had done her independent study on closed ecological systems, and specifically starting with the BIOS experiments that the Russians started in the 60s. Had developed this new model, the 3-zone model, for closed ecological systems, based upon that past 50 years of research and the problems that had been noted, and based upon the 25 years of environmental science knowledge that has been developed since the 1991 through 1993 Biosphere 2 experiment. And she had done that research. She had designed her experiment to start growing things in the basaltic Martian regolith simulant, and getting ready to start that up as soon as she got back from the conference. And there we are in the conference. And after I said my piece and I saw some other students standing up and saying their piece, I had to go off to a business meeting I was having with work. So I had to step out and go find a quiet place, and I had my business meeting. And then I got off my business meeting and I looked at my phone and I saw a text on my phone saying, "Dad, we're around the corner at a bar. There's a bunch of people that want to meet you." And so went and found them, and here's a table filled with college students wanting to get in the space industry. And so we just talked. We kind of spent the rest of the day in Washington, D.C., kind of walking around, getting to know each other, talking about their aspirations and things. And by the time Morgan and I left that day, we decided that we needed to start up a business based upon her research, and start looking to give more people more opportunity in things other than just literally rocket science. And so that's how the company started.
Was there any thought to pursuing a nonprofit as opposed to incorporation type structure?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So that was another thing that I noticed, was that you have the big six NASA space industrial complex corporations, right? The prime contractors of NASA. You have the new commercial startups that are good size now. Jeff Bezos with Blue Origins, and Elon Musk with SpaceX, of course, Virgin Galactic, all these kinds of companies that have big financial backers as their CEOs and chairman, right? Then beyond that, the people that we were meeting who were all excited about doing things, and in fact, who were doing things, they were doing nonprofits. You're exactly right. There were a lot of people that were starting to do their own conferences. In fact, since that conference, Morgan spoke at a Mars Society's conference, and then she also spoke at the New Worlds Conference in Austin, Texas. We've noticed that there are a lot of nonprofit competitions going on, encouraging people to put teams together and do submittals to these competitions and such. And so we saw all that, and there's a lot of good people doing good things there. But we decided that we wanted to be the kind of group that would be going and talking at those conferences rather than organizing those conferences, if you will. And we figured that the best way to do that, rather than attempting to crowdfund for a nonprofit, was to actually go for profit.
So maybe you can talk about that a little bit. Nick, I think you were a little bit curious about the fundraising and the business side of this.
Well, we're all curious about the space startups and how they get going and how they get financed. That's
right. Yeah. So am I. Does anybody know how that works?
Well,
So go ahead.
Yeah. What are the initial steps that one takes?
Yeah. So obviously there's all of the administrivia that has to be done up front. I mean, applying for business licenses and, getting your corporation set up. We've started as a limited liability company in the state of Virginia. And then, of course, beginning to attract the talent that you need. So as a startup, of course, we had already met some people, and so we had some initial interest that came right into that. In fact, one of the individuals who originally started with us and is still with us, his name is Eric de Blackmere, and in fact, he had contacted us even before we had even gone in to do a business, and it said, "Hey, if you're ever going to do anything, let me know." He had been attracted by Morgan. She had started posting her research online before we even started a business. And then it was just Morgan's magnetic personality. She's one of the nicest people you'll ever meet or talk to. She just attracts attention. She gives a talk.
I learned about the company through her interview on the We Martians podcast.
Well, right. Yeah. See, there you go. And so then we end up just getting people contacting us out of the blue saying, "Hey, we love what you're doing. We would love to be involved." And so that's how we started getting people on initially. Of course, the big deal here is how do you take an idea like, building a permanent or establishing a permanent human presence on the surface of Mars, and how do you start making profit with that? Turns out one of the contacts that we had met, and this is where all the serendipity comes in, and this is why I never say no to anybody. I always say yes, but, right? So we had a person that we met at the Humans to Mars, one of these college students. After we got the business started up, I contacted her. I said, "Hey, if you're still interested in doing something, we've got it going now, so we'd love to have you on board." And so she joined us. Turns out that at the same time, she was doing work for a gentleman named Dan Lopez, who was starting up a new space industry crowdfunding business called Orbit Muse.
Is this smaller investor version of something like a Space Angels investor syndicate?
Yes, and you'd probably have to interview Dan to know all the full details of what he has in mind there. But it's not just small investors, but it's also large investors that could be brought into that network. But she put me in contact with him because he was looking for companies that could be his his first group of companies to help get funding. And so we chatted. Turns out he has experience with space startups. He had helped start up Earthcast, which is a Earth imaging company, satellites taking images of Earth. And he had just recently come out of Earthcast and was looking to start up Orbit Muse and was doing other work in the space industry. And so because of his experience and his knowledge with startups, I brought him on as our executive advisor. And so he's actually been helping us get ourselves organized in our startup efforts. So I guess I would say that if you want to start up a new space business, one of the best things that you could do is find somebody who's already done that, right? And
steal all their best ideas.
Get the benefit of their experience, right? So with both he on the team and a number of other individuals, we quickly realized that if you want to attract investors, which is really what you need to do to ultimately do something like build a human settlement on Mars, right? If you want to attract investors, you can't just have the long-term 10, 20 years out, we're going to be able to bring you a profit, because most investors are looking for something in more like 3 years, right? So you have to be able to start generating revenue in a short time frame, 1 to 3 years. And so based upon that, and based upon our particular business, which was this whole 3-zone model concept of agroecology or eco-agriculture, those are synonymous, basically growing things within the context of natural Earth ecosystems, so that you get the benefit of all the ecological services that those things evolved with, that your agriculture evolved with.
And just for listeners out there, we're going to be learning a lot more about the ecological aspects of the 3-zone model from Morgan when we speak to her in the next episode. So
right, exactly. But based upon that, basically, we're trying to set up a space farm, is what it comes down to, right? Build a space farm on Mars. And so the Earth equivalent would be the agricultural industry. There's already farmers on Earth. And so the natural fit was to pivot us back to the agricultural industry. And we identified 14 areas where the farm industry could use some help. Turns out these are the same kinds of problems that you would need to solve anywhere, including on Mars. And in fact, you'd have these problems in spades on Mars, right? So we decided to make the pivot back to Earth agriculture and industry. And so we are working on innovations for the agricultural industry, and that's where we'll start generating our initial revenue. And then as a new space company, so this is the definition of new space that those of us who are in new space are trying to establish and define, is that we develop solutions for Earth, and then we spin that technology in to the space industry. Traditionally, of course, NASA has developed technology for space, and then they have spun it off into Earth businesses, right? So you can go back to the very earliest of the Apollo program and what came out of that. What's one thing that came out of that, guys?
Spinoffs.
Tang, right?
Tang.
That orange drink.
Did you see that need immediately, or was this something you derived from the advice you got from the person who had already been involved in space startups?
Well, having our chief science officer getting a double major in environmental science and biology, and in fact, she's always been environmental science minded, since early years. She's been involved in clam restorations in the Chesapeake Bay, been involved in Virginia forestry. And so she has always been minded that, yeah, I love space and I want to go out into space, but we also got to continue to take care of the Earth. So I like to say that our company does not have an apocalyptic outlook. We're not trying to get to Mars because we think we need to escape Earth. Earth is always going to continue to be our home, our foundation, the basis for our human civilization, no matter how far and wide we may spread in the source, and ultimately in the galaxy. And so we've always been minded toward that way. But of course, when you get into the weeds, get pulled into the weeds of starting up a business, and people are contacting you, and you're talking with a lot of people in the industry, and they want to know, what's different about you, and you're really talking space, you can get drawn away from that relatively easily, especially if you're looking for people who are minded in that same way, right? Who have a vision for doing something like this out in space, and who are going to be self-motivated and self-driven. So we always knew that we wanted to do that, but it was just a matter of convincing ourselves that it needed to be done sooner rather than later, and that it made sense from a business strategy perspective to do that pivot back to Earth.
So for clarification, are these agricultural applications self-contained ecosystem type things, or more applying the 3-zone model ecological principles to more conventional farming practices?
Right. So if you've watched any of Morgan's recent talks that she's done, if you happen to go to the New Worlds conference, I'm not sure whether I think they've just recently posted talks from New Worlds.
And we can throw a link to that in the show notes later on.
She's also posted her TEDx Duke talk that she did recently. And if you watch that, she talks about the concepts of how the problems that we have on Earth are similar to the problems that you would have on Mars. Ultimately, if you go to the most challenging place on Earth that you could find, and you want to grow food there,
Antarctica.
Yeah, say Antarctica. I would say the Arctic Circle, because Antarctica does not have a group of people that are original dwellers of that area still living there, right? So the Arctic Circle, you have the Inuit people, and that's their land. That's where their people have been. That's where they want to stay, right? But climate change is affecting their livelihood. Their food sources are getting more difficult to come by because they depend upon Arctic sea ice, and the Arctic sea ice is not there the way it used to be. And so you go to the Arctic Circle and you're like, well, these people want to stay here. And right now they're having to depend heavily upon food that's shipped in from a distance. It tends to be low quality, pre-processed food, highly expensive, and the challenge, of course, with providing them a local natural food source that would be grown agriculturally is that you don't have sunlight half of the year, nor do you have temperatures, probably longer than a month or two to be able to grow out in the open. So what the situation that you would have there would be similar in some ways to a situation where you'd have on Mars, where you're going to need to have a tighter control over your environment. And so, yeah, the kind of thing that you would do in the Arctic Circle would be quite similar to what you do on Mars. In fact, when you look at Mars, you say, well, you've got to have a water source. You've got to go out and you've got to find your water. You've got to bring it in. Arctic Circle, not so much of a problem, right?
Mm-hmm.
But lighting is a problem. Having lights, all year round so that you can grow things all year round.
And
temperature controls.
In some sense, the energy costs associated with those things might even be a bigger problem in this Arctic Circle context in terms of making the local food source cost competitive with imports.
Right.
Whereas in Mars, maybe energy is probably not the binding constraint, assuming you have solar panels.
Ultimately, the problem on Mars is an economic problem. It's a problem of economics. You've got to be able to build a self-sustaining system that can become Earth independent. Setting up a supply chain from Earth to Mars and keeping it going indefinitely, it's politically infeasible. The first war that comes upon you, or the first recession, suddenly Congress is saying, hey, we've been to Mars. Big deal. Been there, done that, pull funding from the Mars base, pull the people back. Now suddenly we're not on Mars anymore, just like suddenly we weren't on the moon anymore back in the Apollo program. So if you want to get people on Mars, you want to keep them there, you've got to economically bootstrap your system. And so it really does lend itself more to coming up with a business solution. That requires.
Ali, your audio is cutting in and out a little bit. Can you repeat the last thing you said?
The last thing I said was that establishing a base on Mars really does lend itself more to being a for-profit business solution as opposed to a not-for-profit solution that requires a constant funding stream from beneficent investors or from governments with deep pockets. And so, yeah, same thing on Earth. You want to be able to provide a sustainable solution. And we can already see, and I don't want to make this too political, but there can be challenges with a system that's completely socialistic or that's completely communistic, where the government is providing all of your needs. You've got to make the economy work, and it's got to function on business principles here.
So in that sense, you might say the minimum viable product in this Arctic example is some sort of greenhouse type system that can be deployed at scale that's cost competitive with imported food.
Right, exactly.
And did you find a solution to the lighting problem?
Well, we're working on those things, and in
So,
fact, you could look out in industry right now, um, with the technology that's being developed in space programs and space industry, with technology that's being developed in the agricultural industry, and there's a lot of pieces that are out there that can be brought together and begin to put together a complete solution, but they're not all out there yet. Go ahead.
I'm very curious if the obvious parallel to growing food in the Arctic, where you need to have artificial lights, is the enormous amount of dope that's being grown now in warehouses under grow lights, and if you've learned from that example.
Yeah, well, the challenge there, of course, is that the dope has a higher profit margin,
Yeah.
and so therefore you can afford the high cost of power to grow those plants. What you're looking at in the agricultural industry is something that's more of a commodity market. Pot might eventually become a commodity market, and it's probably, at least in Colorado, it's probably close to becoming that way. But food really is, this is a commodity market. Everything drives the cost of food down, because basically food is at the bottom of the economic value adding chain, right? And so what you've really got to do is you've got to get the cost of growing food down. And that's really what small farmers and food growers need today. If you're looking at the people that are in the most need in the agricultural industry, it would be small farmers and food growers, because they're having to compete with large conglomerated farms, which can use scale to get their costs of doing business, per bushel down, if you will. They're also having to compete politically for natural resources. So when you're talking about, everybody that's sucking off of the local water source, and now you have some small farmers over here, and then you have this large conglomerated farm over here. The politics could lean more towards the large industry.
So one thing that could help you is if oil prices spike up again, and then the shipping cost of bringing food to remote parts of the world drives your competitors' prices up.
But you don't want to have a solution that depends upon a market, any particular market going one way or another. You want to address serious problems that your particular market sector in the agricultural industry is having today, and those are the problems that you want to solve. So getting the cost of water down would be one thing, or getting water use down or water loss down, right? So if there's a particular farm that has a ration of water that they get from the local water district, and that's all they get, and that farmer's looking at it and they're going, I don't know how I'm going to make it this year on that much water. Well, how do you help that farmer? So you help that farmer by figuring out how to keep from losing that water once you've used it the first time. So you want to be able to take water into the system, and you want to keep moving it around the system and keep reclaiming it and recycling it, right? So when you talk about having to do that, then you really are saying, well, now we're talking about no more open field farming. We're talking about contained farming, right? So now you're in some kind of a relatively closed system where you take water into it and your water loss out of it is minimized. if you can do that, now you've gotten that farmer down to only needing a trickle feed of new water. And now that farmer has become more economically sustainable from at least the water perspective, right? So, and I know that's a problem that a lot of people are working on, and there's, in fact, there's an X Prize out there right now, and it's not so much a water recycling system as it is. I think the X Prize is pulling water out of the air, basically, right? How do you design?
Is this a Diamandis Prize? The Peter Diamandis, his organization?
I believe so.
I'll have to look that up. I've never heard of it.
Yeah, I'm not completely familiar with the details, but so same kind of idea. Everybody knows water's a problem. It's becoming more and more of a problem, and especially if you're looking at trying to feed the world on local food sources, which means that you pretty much have to use local water sources. Well, not every place has a good local water source to help feed all the local people. So how do you do that? That's an economics problem. It's a technology problem, right? But you're using technology to solve the economics problem. And you could probably brainstorm a list of other kinds of resources that farmers have to use. And the costs of these resources are going up, or the availability is not there year round.
Migrant labor, for example.
All right. And so now you're looking at, okay, well, now how do you do robotics, right? If you can't get migrant labor year round, or if the current administration doesn't support migrant labor so much. So these are, and you talk to any farmer and they're probably going to tell you these are all really economics problems that these farmers are dealing with. Farmers have to be really intelligent business people. They have to be very sharp. They have to be really good about taking whatever profit that they manage to eke out of any given year and spreading that profit out over the years where they're not making so much of a profit, if any. Farmers are probably the best business people that we have in the world, just because they have to make the business work. But it's still becoming a struggle for them. And in fact, rural communities, I think that, my opinion, there's a lot of rural communities that are going into economic depressions because the small farmers are being driven out of business. And so you get these large conglomerated industrial farms. These are large companies that have corporate offices in some big city somewhere, and that profit's being pulled in, and it's not going into that local economy. In fact, it's not really going into many local economies. It ends up going back to corporate and getting spread out to the shareholders or whatever the case may be. And this is a real problem. It's a Walmart kind of problem, right? Where you have the big company.
When you start discussing the economics of farming, though, don't you also run into the division between those sectors of the farming industry that are getting general supports from national governments and those that are getting no support at all? Like the sugar industry, which is artificially propped up in the United States, and
yeah, which is funny, considering that our soft drinks are mostly made with corn syrup. It's very hard to find a soft drink made with sugar in the United States.
That's direct cause. Corn sweetener. The U.S. government supports corn sweetener, supports the growing of corn, supports the growing of sugar. Where there are people who are really into soft drinks who go to Mexico to get soft drinks that are made with actual cane sugar because it tastes better.
That's right. Yeah. Even though the sugar industry is propped up or protected in the U.S., so. But it happens that the corn industry gets even better.
Even more.
Yeah, and that's the thing. I mean, I am all for government. I am all for government causes that take into consideration the nation and the economy as a whole. But we do tend to create unintended consequences for ourselves.
Market distortion. When the government interferes, it creates a market distortion.
Right.
And then you get these ripples outward, like soft drinks made from corn syrup sweetener, which has to go through multiple industrial processes rather than just making it from cane sugar, excuse me.
Exactly. So, and all of this stuff, and of course, the tendency is for money to leave the little guys and go towards the big guys. When you have systems such as what we have set up that aren't that well, it's really the politics of the systems. So
the big guys can afford lawyers and lobbyists, and the small businesses can't. I run into that every day.
And again, I'm not an anti-industrialist. I'm not an anti-corporatist. I'm all for business. I'm all for capitalism and free markets and things like that. There are times where government needs to step in and regulate that. Because I think even in an ideal free market, you'd still eventually have, most of the resources going towards a few people. But if you can give the little guy the means to compete, and if you can change the minds of the people, so it is a cultural change, and change the minds of the people towards supporting their local economy, then you can bootstrap these small farmers, and you can bootstrap these rural localities that are going into recession and depression, and you can rejuvenate them with an agricultural base built on their small farmers, and then they can continue to build up their economy from there, with farm services, and then of course then the additional businesses that can then come in on top of that. The way any locality goes from an agrarian society to eventually more industrial, etc.
So I think you've convinced. I've been pleasantly surprised. It seems like there's actually a bigger addressable market for these terrestrial applications of the technology than I might have thought going into this. But unless anybody objects, our listenership is probably also interested in this sort of longer term vision for the company. And sure. I think there might be some interesting things to talk about in terms of the economics of the actual Mars-based product.
But what this seems to be pointing at is that the future of Martian agriculture is the small Martian farmer.
Well, I mean, so you look at the way humans evolved on Earth, right? And I hope I'm not stealing too much of Morgan's thunder, but humans started, as far as we can tell, as hunter-gatherers, right?
Right.
And they moved from there into an agrarian form of society that had central habitation areas where people would gather together for mutual protection, and to pool their resources economically to be able to grow their food, and sustain a protective force who weren't growing food but were standing guard, right? Protecting from marauders and such. The blight would come through, wipe out their crops. They'd go out into their wilderness and survive until the next season, on wild things from the wilderness, animals and wild growing food and such. until they could recover from the blight, or marauders would come through, and steal all their food, whatever the case may be.
The hill people who got pushed out of the lowlands when the settled agriculturalists started using that for food.
Exactly. And so you go from something like that to, and thousands of years later, guys, I think I'm losing you. Hold on a second.
Well, we can hear him. Oh, okay.
I could hear him up to when he stopped. I guess that's tautological.
Yeah.
He might have been on a battery-powered device that lost power. I'll re-invite him.
Oh, that'll get you every time, the batteries.
So he mentioned two conferences, the Humans to Mars Summit, and I see there's going to be another Human to Mars Summit just a month from now, May 9th through 11th in 2017. And he also mentioned the New Worlds 2016 that took place in November in Austin, Texas. And I see there's going to be a 2017 New Worlds conference again in November. So I'd be interested to know if Deep Space Ecology is going to be once again appearing in those venues. Do you know about anything about that?
I do not. Hopefully we'll be able to ask Lee if he gets that. Sorry, I'm just sending the Hangout link to him again.
No, well, the Humans to Mars conference is coming up. It's about a month from now.
It's May 9th to 11th.
And it's right in my backyard. This is my backyard, George Washington University. Do
you think you might stop in?
Well, if senior management approves, I might.
Oh, you mean your actual boss? You have to get. To give a talk, I assume you.
No, I'm not going to give him a talk, but not a month out. That's not going to happen. No, if I say your management, I mean my wife.
So one thing,
Sam, you've obviously never been married.
That is true. One thing we'd thought about talking about was the Mars Ice House. I don't know if Paul, you were edit this out pending Lee's rejoining the conversation, or we can just talk about that for a little while if you want.
Well, the Mars Ice House is an interesting concept. It involves using ice indigenous to Mars to shield against radiation. And now the Mars Ice House people they're quite a different crowd from the usual space geek. They're designers and architects. And
right. I don't know much about it, but I got the sense that part of the reason they designed it was they thought it would look really cool.
Well,
to build a dome out of ice.
That's not a bad reason, by the way.
You mean for marketing purposes, it's not a bad reason?
No, I mean, it's not a bad reason in general.
For human flourishing, to do something just for the aesthetic sake of it.
Oh, no, just aesthetics are a very good guide to what actually works in engineering. The ultimate solution, the best solutions are both beautiful and true. Now, if you have a solution that's beautiful but not true, you reject it. But Lee is back.
Hey, back.
Oh, hello. Hello, Lee. Thank you. Thanks for coming back. You can leave your video off if that cuts your bandwidth a little bit.
Yeah, I think that was the problem. So my video's off now.
Okay, that's fine.
All right. So where were we?
Well, while you were gone, we were actually just discussing another vision for Mars habitat design, the Mars Ice House.
Yes.
Yeah, and if you have any knowledge or thoughts about that, we'd be very curious to know what Deep Space Ecology thinks about kind of the ecosystem of habitat designs that are out there.
Right. So of course, the design that you have the key is that you have to be able to build it on Mars. Initially, your building is going to probably be heavily subsidized by the deep pockets of Elon Musk or some government. But beyond that, the way or the particular technology that you use almost doesn't matter as long as it is sustainable with Earth independence. So, for example, let's say that you build this system on Mars. Things eventually wear down. Walls, even well-sealed walls eventually become unsealed, begin to leak. Containment systems, whatever the case may be, or you get a puncture in a piece of glass or in a piece of plastic. You need to be able to repair that, right?
We all learned that from The Martian. Yes.
Yes.
That's right. Yeah, I
And
couldn't
you don't
believe
want it to
that.
blow up on your face.
I'm like, you got to be kidding me. That plastic wrapping that facility looks like it's Walmart grade plastic tarp.
That's almost certainly what it was. Actually, by the way.
They couldn't come up with a better material than that.
Well, they spent all their budget on hiring Matt Damon.
Yeah. So, but so when you first go and you build this base on Mars, you are going to use, some high technology initially to get things going. And that's going to have some cost with it. Like I said, it's going to have to be initially funded by some deep pockets. But if you want to make that system economically sustainable, then you have to make it Earth independent, because again, you don't want to be dependent upon a politically infeasible, highly expensive supply chain. And you could go ahead and pre-stage, 3 years worth of spare parts ahead of going there. You're eventually going to run out of those spare parts, and then what are you going to do, right? So we think that there's going to be a transition from an initial high-tech startup effort toward a early industrial age functionality. So what we're talking about is brick and clay kilning. We're talking about glass blowing. We're talking about metal forging, and we're literally, with bellows and hammer and anvil, right? We think that you're going to have to kind of transition from a high-tech startup to kind of an early industrial age capability, where you can sustain a system on being able to manually produce the materials that you need to keep the system going. So with that in mind, the question is, well, could we send a room full of 3D printers to Mars? And let's say that we happen to be so good with developing 3D printing technology in the next 10 years that we are able to develop 3D printers for integrated circuits, 3D printers for concrete, for fiberglass, for glass even, 3D printers for plastic and for any number of things. Let's say that we could make anything that we needed to make with 3D printers. And let's say that we were even able to set things up such that the 3D printers could make spare parts for each other, so that when the 3D printers broke, that you could make a spare part to replace a part on another 3D printer. If you could do that, the question would be, would you be able to continue to run your high tech based upon having that kind of a 3D printer technology capability? It really comes down to what kind of volume of parts can you produce with those 3D printers, and can you keep up with your need? You probably could.
So you're assuming this like almost godlike level of 3D printer technology.
Well,
you're saying
exactly.
Even assuming you have it, you might still be constrained by the efficiency.
Yeah, way beyond what 3D printers can do now. I mean, they're not high tech. They print plastic parts or metal parts, but they don't print microelectronics.
Right, but imagine that you could, if you have to be able to do it fast enough to overcome capital depreciation, right? The wear and tear.
Right. But let's say you even know okay, so let's assume you could do that. So the question in my mind is, can you do that? Are we going to be able to advance our 3D printing capability that well in 10 years?
I'd say probably not, right?
That's what I'm guessing.
I
We want to be able to start building a permanent human presence on Mars in 10 years. I can't depend upon 3D printer technology to be ready for that.
That's true.
So I assume that the one of the first things that would be built with a significant human population would be a basic machine shop. And so you would have machine tools that you would have to bring from Earth, and you might not be able to build microprocessors, but you could build basic farming implements, and you build the forge that you need to have if there's any presumably there's iron on Mars because the whole thing is red, so you could produce the steel you need for things like that. But then if you had a stream of people arriving like Elon Musk imagines, so you're building the population all the time, each wave of immigrants would bring with them the most recent pocket computers. It would work until they broke down. So you'd have an influx of high-tech devices on the one hand. On the other hand, you would have the basic machine shop producible goods that you would produce locally on Mars.
Yeah, I think it might be more closely. I think the immigration might be more like what we saw into Ellis Island than the arrivals on, international flights into the UK from the United States. I don't think people are going to have the ability to bring a bunch of stuff with them if they go to Mars, just because the cost of transport is so high. The wealthy individuals might do that, but even then, I mean, you look at the history of settlement anywhere else in the history of the world. Even when the wealthy individuals went ahead and resettled with all the poor individuals, they would eventually have to go with the locals, right? Until they could get a cost-effective means of constant supply from the metropolitan areas of the day.
Right. Rich people in Boston learned to eat food that the Native Americans liked rather than importing their favorite goodies from Europe, right?
So yeah, and that's the point. So I think, like I said, you may eventually set up your system with some high tech, but you're going to, if you want to be Earth independent, if you want to be independent of flaky politics that could end your Mars settlement prematurely, I think we're going to have to transition from that initial high tech startup toward, like I said, an early industrial kind of society. And
So
it's
so
going to be,
concrete.
it's steampunk, I think, really would be the future of Mars. I mean, if you think about it, here you are on Mars, right? You got there using a spaceship. You landed using some high-tech system that was built for landing people, one of the most challenging landings that we have, right, on Mars. And now suddenly you're living in this high-tech, dome system, with hydroponics and stuff like this, and you have an industrial space built off to the side that has an ancient iron forge in it, and like I said, a brick kiln and a glass blower, and
robust 19th century technologies that you can account on to be serviced by human beings and be iterable for the foreseeable future.
Well, we're leaving out this sort of intermediate step, which is processing Mars materials into something we can manage with on our anvil and our
right.
So I mean, we humans have been processing metals for thousands of years. We have a lot of knowledge about that. Can we make that work for us in terms of the in situ materials and refining them into various things that we'll need, like metals, volatiles,
right.
and so forth?
Yeah, right. Well, that's definitely the question, isn't it? And so that's the kind of problem that I like to have our scientists and our engineers work on.
Okay,
is how you do that.
Yeah, Lee, I'm interested in how you are. I know this is a bit of unplowed ground. So far, space entrepreneurs have either failed or have been very, very well funded by people.
Right.
Whether it's Planetary Resources or SpaceX or Blue Origin, they all have very, very wealthy people backing them up.
Sure.
How do you go? I'm not sure. I'm not saying you've solved this problem, but
I'm not saying I can tell you how I have solved it.
But what's your vision? What's your vision for getting from? Okay, we have this fantastic concept for making sustainable settlements on Mars. To who's going to pay for all this? How do we do that?
Right. So I mean, if you're going to make any business work, you've got to start generating a revenue, right?
Right.
And you've either got to have a business model that is so well known by banks that you go in and they're like, oh yeah, we'll finance that. You have a good credit score. We can see that the area could stand to have more businesses like yours, or you're developing technology that isn't in the area, that you're going to sell it outside the area that's economically feasible. So, and you can do that with relatively common businesses. People do it every day and they get bank financing, right?
Right, but that's not that's not the space you live in.
That's not necessarily what we're doing, right? So we realize that we've got to start generating revenue. All right.
Right.
If we can start generating revenue, and if we can have a market strategy that appears to be feasible based upon having proved that we can generate some revenue, then the next step that you do with that is you take that revenue record, you take that market strategy, you take your Elon Musk style slide deck and your business plan, and you go to some venture capital firms and some angel investors, and you present that. You show them your financials that you've managed to do on your own without any financing. You show them the business partnerships that you have that helped you make that happen, and the existing market segment that you're serving. And you find some venture capital firms that are willing to give you some goals with some money attached, right? So, well, if you guys can do this, then we'll give you this much money, and then if you make it to this next milestone, then we'll give you this much money.
Right.
And they give you some letters of intent, right?
Right.
You take those letters of intent with your existing business model and revenue stream, partnerships, all that, and you go to some banks, you get some financing. You use the financing to help you meet those milestones, to get the venture capital to help you meet the further milestones. You grow your business and you follow your market strategy, and you're successful, right?
So concretely, those milestones would be scaling up the terrestrial applications,
Right.
in the first couple of years.
But that's all magic, what I just said, right? It's textbook. Oh, this is all you have to do. Just do that and you'll be successful, right?
Okay. Now,
it still comes down to you have to generate that initial revenue. You have to show that you have a market.
Right. Now, and that, that's not surprising, but okay. Let's say by accident you happen to get into an elevator with your favorite bazillionaire tomorrow morning. What's your elevator speech?
What's my elevator speech?
I hope you have that ready.
Well, I can't give you my elevator speech because that would give away information that I would only want to give away to somebody who wouldn't tell it to anybody else, lest they miss their own opportunity for making money off of it.
I see. Okay.
So, but
well, can you abstract it a bit for us then?
Right. So I have a half-hour speech. So what would I say in seconds?
That's a very tall building, by the way.
Yeah. So what we say in seconds is we're going to be the company to help humans settle on Mars by solving food security on Mars. And we know that the best way to solve food security on Mars is to solve food security on Earth first.
That's excellent. I just invested my $100 million in you.
That is a great elevator pitch.
So, the wrong way of saying that is the Mars problem is easy to solve. First, all you have to do is solve world hunger. Now, that would probably deter people from.
No, that's fantastic. That's a fantastic angle to come in at.
Well, right.
I don't agree. I don't think.
It can certainly capture attention, but people are like, yeah, you're going to solve world hunger, right?
Well, that gets you into that inevitable dead end of we have to get perfect on Earth before we do anything.
Well, but world hunger has been beaten down quite a bit lately.
But the key is that you don't have to solve hunger everywhere in the world. You just have to solve it locality by locality.
Okay.
So you eat the elephant one bite at a time, right? But
no, I eat the whole elephant all at once. But
right.
Go ahead.
If you can eat that bite that has you recovering the economy of a village in drought-stricken, war-torn Somalia, where there's no political infrastructure to support it, no supply chain capability of any great extent that isn't subject to warlords. But if you can solve food security for them in that locality, Well, then you've just demonstrated that you're the go-to company for doing it on Mars. Because the problems are very much the same.
Okay.
Highly expensive, politically infeasible supply chain, drought, extreme environment, no way to grow food out in the open and have any great success at it. And humans that their daily effort is just raw survival. That's exactly what you're going to have on Mars. And so if you can help people reestablish an agricultural basis in that kind of a situation, then you can do it on Mars. It's just a matter of getting a ride there to do it.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm proposing that our business be the ones to make the rockets and the transport ships. Like I said, that's what we saw at that first conference we went to, was that there's plenty of people doing that.
Okay.
I don't need to compete with that. They're already doing that.
Yeah. I get it, but so what are you guys doing physically to show that you've got this solved?
Right. Yeah. So we currently have an engineering team and science team of 30 plus people. We are working on the innovations that we need to be able to go to any small farmer, any economically depressed food desert inner city in the United States, or go to the Arctic Circle, or go to a desert area in South America or a drought-stricken area in Africa. We have a team of people working on those innovations. And it's just a matter of which innovation do you take to market first to generate that revenue stream and to demonstrate that you have a feasible business model.
Do you have a sense of what that is, what the answer to that question is?
Well, if I didn't, we'd be in trouble. So I think we do, but we're not ready to share that information.
Got it.
Since Deep Space Ecology is focused on closed ecological systems, I assume that many of the technologies, if not all of the technologies you are working on, and techniques as well, not just technologies,
right, exactly,
would be applicable to artificial habitats or to the moon or to other places. So I'm interested, is that accurate? And if it is accurate, why have you chosen to focus on Mars rather than on artificial habitats?
Because Mars is what's captured the public attention, and what has gotten us as far as we have gotten in terms of capturing the public attention. I mean, if you look at social media, if you look at the news, I wouldn't say Deep Space on big yet, but we have captured some attention, and we've done it in less than a year. And we've done it primarily with one person, our Chief Science Officer, Morgan Irons, and her ideas. And that much has brought us all the attention that we needed to get our business going and to get ourselves set up to generate revenue in the next 6 months.
So I have to ask this question because otherwise I won't forgive myself.
Sure.
The White House chief strategist, Steve Bannon, is noteworthy as an investor in Biosphere too. So can we break the news here that Steve Bannon is investing in Deep Space Ecology, or
no?
But more seriously,
the secret why he just left the National Security Council, because he decided to
run the investment.
focus his efforts here at Deep Space Ecology.
No. More realistically, does the legacy of the Biosphere projects have any resonance 25 years later, or is it faded enough from public consciousness that people don't run scared from self-contained ecosystems? Just that phrase was probably a little scary to investors in the mid-90s.
So even though it's easy to say the term closed ecological system, people who know tend to recognize that. That's really not the term that I like to use. I like to use quasi-closed eco-agricultural system. So
Quasi-closed.
Yeah, it doesn't roll off the tongue as easily.
Right, or you could say managed eco-agricultural system. So the point is that the concept, so the whole Biosphere 2 concept was just basically, it was the idea of how would we create another Earth, right? And so they basically tried to do that. They sealed themselves up. Literally, the only thing that was supposed to be able to go in and out was light and heat, right? And so, but in terms of air exchange, the only gas that was going in and out of there was hydrogen, because you can't stop hydrogen from penetrating anything, basically. But beyond that, the gases were contained. The energy systems were contained, and the idea was, could you mimic Earth? And so they wanted to seal themselves in an attempt to mimic Earth, so that they wouldn't have the rest of Earth supporting them, because then you really wouldn't be mimicking Earth; you would just be an extension of Earth. So that's why they did that. The understanding of ecological theory, of environmental science, wasn't at the level it is today, and we've learned a lot since then. And what we've learned, we would not set up a biosphere in the same way that Biosphere 2 was set up, because it wasn't set up to function the way a natural ecosystem functions. It was an attempt to take, a majority of the kinds of biomes that exist on Earth and put them all together under the same dome, basically a Noah's Ark of biomes, if you will. And those biomes don't naturally occur right next to each other in nature. You don't have desert naturally occurring next to rainforest with no transition space between them, right?
It's true. When you read about the biosphere design on Wikipedia or whatever, it all sort of seems terribly naive in retrospect. But
yeah, and retrospect is the key there. I think the people that built that and that were involved in it were very sharp, very intelligent people. But we learned a lot from that. So the whole 3-zone model that Morgan developed is based upon the concept of being able to support your agriculture and your people with this ecological buffer zone, and basically setting yourself up an ecosystem with the humans living at the center of it, which basically gives the humans the context that they evolved in and that they've always lived in. But now you're taking that context with you, into space. Or you're trying to reestablish that context in a place that has failed, or that no longer supports wild growing plant life, if you will, to any great extent, which is what you would have to do in a desert or in the Arctic Circle or whatever the case may be.
So I think we're getting a little towards the end of our time here.
Sure.
If there's any topics anybody wants to wrap up with, speak now or forever hold your peace.
I would like to just ask Lee real briefly, since the brief period of time when you were off, we were asking about the couple of conferences. You mentioned the Humans to Mars conference and the New Worlds conference. Will you or Deep Space Ecology be presenting again at the 2017 versions of those?
So we're going to be at the National Space Society Conference in St. Louis at the end of March. We've been invited to the biannual conference in the United Kingdom at the beginning of June. We're probably not going to be able to make that, but we'll see. And we will be again at the Mars Society, and we've also been invited back to New Worlds Conference. There's a number of other solicitations that we've received, and we're in the process of considering those. But really, and we want to be able to support our conferences, and we want to be able to support the open source discussion, if you will, and the entire community. And we're going to be doing that. But our main focus right now really is developing these innovations, getting these innovations into the market, and developing a sustainable for-profit business that can be part of the solution for human expansion in space, to the moon, to Mars, to Europa, wherever we may want to go. So the business side of this really is vitally important. The NASA model is not intended to create human settlement. It is mission-based. It sends people or robots someplace, and once it does something, it says, been there, done that, and it moves on. It really is up to private industry, for commercial interests and for human interests to come behind that and take over. If we want humans living in space, it really is going to depend upon the way humans have always expanded. A group of people who decide they want to go live over there now, because where they are right now isn't making it for them. And so they find some benefactor, financial benefactor, or somebody who's providing transportation services. They put together the money that they have to be able to afford the ticket, and they go, and they don't come back. That's the way human settlement has always occurred, and so we think that's the way human settlement needs to occur in this case, and we want to be able to be one of those businesses to support that. Elon Musk is going to take 100 people at a time. We want to be able to be the company that provides the hotel courtyard, if you will, for those people. We're going to be providing, that agricultural system to provide the food, and also that ecological buffer zone to provide that natural wilderness area to not only provide the ecological services that the humans and the agriculture will need to survive, but also that mental break that humans need. Staring at metal walls 24 hours a day, weeks on end, they're going to go crazy. Step out into open space and see living, growing things. And that's what we want to provide.
Okay.
Great. Any parting thoughts from either Nick or Paul?
This has been a great conversation. I think it needs to continue. I know there's a lot of proprietary stuff that Lee can't share with us, but in 2 weeks we'll be talking to Morgan, so who's
That's right.
apparently the font of ideas here. So hopefully she'll share with us what she can. and I can't hook you up with these billionaires, but if I could, I would.
Hopefully they're listening.
Yes, one of our listeners.
Well, that's a bit of a forlorn hope, but
Elon, call me.
yeah, okay. Elon, call Lee. He'll take your call if you're really serious.
Go for Jeff Bezos. He's got more money than Elon Musk.
Or,
Yeah,
well,
we'll talk to anybody. We think Elon's going to be the first person to go, but literally we'll talk with anybody.
you look at who's got the most cash reserves in the world, including all governments. It's Apple and Google, right? Not
Right.
Norway's sovereign wealth fund is getting quite large too.
Well, right, and there's a company called Ripple Aerospace being funded out of Norway that are beginning to develop their own rocket technology, and we've had some conversations with them as well.
Oh, very good.
All right. Well, thanks again to Lee Irons. This has been episode 71 of the Unseen Podcast. Good night, everyone.
Good night. Thank you.
Good night.
Good night.